Some people are disappointed when they first see the most famous painting in the world. At first glance, it doesn't have the wow factor that other paintings in the Louvre have. It lacks drama. But if we can ignore the hundreds of people that surround her, if we can turn down the volume and just push the off button for a second, what we actually see is a quiet, contemplative portrait. A portrait that is the greatest psychological portrait ever painted. A portrait so ahead of its time that centuries later we are still trying to figure it out. In 1517, the French king, King Francis I, offered Leonardo a job, court painter and engineer and architect to the king. Leonardo, now in his 60s, moved to the Chateau of Amboise in France and never went back to Italy. He brought with him dozens of sketchbooks like these, but just one painting, the Mona Lisa. Leonardo knew how important it was. He knew it was a masterpiece. Mona Lisa is the end product of the greatest inquisitive mind in history, a self-made man with a voracious appetite for knowledge, a man who dedicated himself to the study of anatomy, geology, and philosophy. Actually, let's start with what she's not wearing. When was the last time you employed a professional photographer? The answer is usually a wedding or a prom. What were you wearing in your prom photo? Your best clothes? Your best jewellery? Of course. Being painted by one of the most celebrated and in-demand painters of the day is your chance to really show off. And yet Mona Lisa is stripped of all the usual high-status symbols. Her clothes are nothing special, they tell us nothing. Instead of the usual flamboyant, expensive outfits we usually see in commissioned portraits of the aristocracy, hers are pretty simple for a wealthy woman. Along with the complete lack of jewellery and the simple hair, they serve one purpose and one purpose only. Leonardo made sure we would not be distracted from the face of Mona Lisa. Leonardo uses the classic pyramid-shaped composition that was introduced during the Renaissance. It is an important change from the paintings of the 15th century. The structure provides stability, but more importantly, it provides a clear centre of focus and directs your gaze. In Mona Lisa's case, it is pulling us into her face. The Mona Lisa is the earliest Italian portrait to focus on the sitter in a 3/4 length pose rather than full length. But why? Because he completely fills the frame with his subject, making the painting more intimate and cutting down on distractions. This 3/4 length pose becomes the norm for 400 years after Leonardo pioneers it. Today we look at Mona Lisa's pose and it seems fairly normal, but for its day it was groundbreaking. Previously, subjects were stiff and upright, aristocratic, but Mona Lisa is relaxed. Her hands are resting gently on the arm of her chair as she turns towards us, almost as if it's a snapshot. Mona Lisa is also rather content and self-assured, which was more how aristocratic men were portrayed, not women. We are looking directly into her eyes and she is looking directly at us. Women in paintings just didn't do that. They didn't look boldly and directly at the viewer. The entire painting deviated from the traditional way women were painted in Italy. Portraits were usually drawn with an open sky as the background, a monotone background, or a simple room. Mona Lisa is in front of a complicated landscape that only existed in Leonardo's imagination. Paintings of this period had both the subject and the background in sharp focus, whereas the background of the Mona Lisa seems to fade or become more blurred and out of focus the further from the subject it extends. This is aerial perspective, and Leonardo invented it. Behind Mona Lisa, the vast landscape recedes to distant icy mountains. A path and a bridge are our only indication of human presence. The curves of her hair and clothing reflect the rolling valleys and rivers behind her, connecting humanity and nature, a favourite theme of Leonardo's. The earth seems to twist like her torso. Look at the river on the right. It flows into the scarf over her left shoulder. We see that she is connected with the earth. There is another visual trick that gives an illusion of movement. The horizon of the landscape does not quite line up behind the figure. It is very slightly skewed, whilst her shoulders are painted level. Leonardo knew that our brains would struggle with this conflicting visual information. We know that the horizon should line up, so we read it as level. This then causes us to interpret the shoulders as being on a slant, which they are not. As our brain corrects this, it creates an illusion of movement, as if the figure shuffles a little bit in its frame. As we look into her eyes, the shadows and tones suggest the curvature of a smile. But when your eyes go directly to Mona Lisa's mouth, your central vision doesn't see the shadows, and she isn't smiling, smirking at best. We can prove this theory quite simply by staring directly into her eyes and think about how much she is smiling. Then scan back and forth between her eyes and her lips, and her expression changes. That is not your imagination. It is all to do with how we see, not how we think. The genius of Leonardo is that he understood this 500 years ago. The Mona Lisa became the most famous painting in the world, not just because of hype or chance, but because for 500 years, viewers have been able to feel an emotional engagement with her. Before the Mona Lisa, portraits lacked mystery. Artists only represented outward appearances. Mona Lisa, however, is alive, a living, breathing woman with a soul. When you stand in front of the Mona Lisa, you are looking at more than just a portrait of an individual. You are looking at the accumulated knowledge of a genius who blended art, science, and magic to create a profound meditation on what it means to be human. Whether she is Mona Lisa, La Gioconda, or La Joconde, she is the face of a revolution in art.